Hey everyone, this is That Guy in Hutch, Jason Probst, and you're listening to That Podcast in Hutch. Today I'm excited to have with me the Kansas State Treasurer, Lynn Rogers, with me. And actually, it's kind of nice. I'm sitting in his sunroom in his house, and I've never done a podcast recording there before, but it's a nice environment on a rainy day. Lynn, thanks for hanging out with me today.
Glad to be here.
So I wanted to talk with you a little bit. My thinking is we hear treasurer and we know we vote for it every 4 years. But I think that a lot of us might not know, even to some degree, I don't know the details of the job. But before we get into that, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about kind of your early career and how you came to Kansas. You're originally from Nebraska, right?
Right, by way of Chicago.
By way of Chicago. So in your early career, you worked in farm credit, farm finance, right?
Yeah. I was recruited here to Kansas in mid-'80s to work for the Federal Land Bank and the Federal Intermediate Credit Bank and the Bank for Cooperatives, or the Farm Credit Banks here in Wichita. So,
and that was probably somewhere in there. It wasn't a great time to be connected to farm credit.
We moved here May 1st, and so it's almost a full 37 years. And a month later, on June 1st, they announced losses of about $180 million. And so we had they had just built a new building, hired a bunch of staff, and they ended up laying off about a third of their staff at that point. And I think we had 3 or 4 reorganizations after that, a lot fewer people over that period of time. So,
well, and I hadn't planned to ask this, but this piques my curiosity. What happened in the mid-'80s to kind of create the farm crisis?
Well, the commodity prices, of course, went down, and interest rates went way up. That was a period of time with high inflation. They were trying to curb that, and so interest rates went from 4 or 5% to 21, 22%, and that's one of the problems when we came, is that they had no cap on how high they could go, and so a combination of those things. We had the 80s. In embargo to Russia, that cut exports. So all of those things really, did a number on farmers and ranchers. And of course, that had followed a great expansion in the 70s, where ag had done very well. A lot of people bought pretty high-priced land, and kind of there was a concept that they're not going to make more, so you better buy when the neighbor piece comes up. So farmers would take a piece that was in their family, paid off, and use that as part of their down payment. And so, they just got upside down on a lot of different properties. I remember, it's been a while now, but I think over 3,000 bankruptcies across the country, which is an average of only 1 per county, but still, some counties were hit much harder than others.
Yeah. And I think Kansas was hit particularly hard in that time, wasn't it?
Yeah. Kansas and the bank we worked with handled Oklahoma, Colorado, New Mexico, and Kansas, and so the Midwest was hit especially hard.
I only remember that because I remember my dad kept losing jobs during that time.
Oh, yeah.
He was a welder, and so working on farm equipment or implements or whatever. And then this company they had their orders fell out, and so it affected a lot of things.
Yeah, I think a dealership in every county went down, and of course it was also oil prices. A lot of independent oil firms here in Wichita went bankrupt, and then the aircraft industry. So it was kind of a triple hit for the Wichita economy. So,
but you stayed in that industry for a while. You were in some marketing and some leasing.
It was always interesting. We had about 35 in the marketing staff. I got to keep one of the 3 jobs that was there, and then we developed the adjustable rate mortgage and did a lot of marketing and efforts, helped people refinance some of those high priced loans into some more of that were a little bit more cost effective, and then switched over to the leasing company in the early 90s.
Well, you talked about kind of working on a fixed rate loan because so many people had some of those variables in it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, when we came, the variable rate was it was just not hooked or pegged to anything. If the bank wanted to raise it because they sneezed, they could, and so rates had jumped quite a ways. And the farmers also had to provide a pretty good chunk of stock. 10% of their loan had to be stock. And so that combination really hurt. And so when we went to the fixed rate, they could lock it in for a 10-year, 15 or 20 or 30-year loan, that rate would stay the same for that entire period of time. And same with the variable, they could do a 3-year adjustable. I had seen the bank, the savings and loan I'd come from in Chicago had those kind of programs. They were very popular. We had done a lot of research through all 4 of our states of what was popular. And actually, Kansas and the Wichita Bank was the first farm credit entity in the country that went to those. And now they don't even offer a variable with no cap. At least I don't think they do.
Yeah, there has to be some trigger or something, right?
Yeah, it's tied to treasury bonds or something, so that you can also kind of anticipate that if you see these rates going up, you think, okay, when it reprices, in a year or 2 years, it's probably going to be this. Gives farmers an opportunity to plan and kind of prepare for it before they, their payment could be $15,000, the next year it could be 30, and they'd have no control over it. So.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was thinking. Is it creates some predictability, so you kind of know what to expect.
Yeah, similar to a home loan, and there's they've gotten a lot more sophisticated, of course, and farmers as they've gotten larger, but banking still stays very similar. Lending from personal to business.
Mm-hmm. So somewhere in there, so you're doing that work, and then sometime in the '90s, you get conned into getting into public service.
Well, actually, yeah, it started our oldest, when he went to kindergarten. I went to my first parent-teacher organization meeting, and I volunteered to help raise money. I did the Riverside auction, and we raised, I think, $3,500 that year, the most we'd ever raised, and bought some new playground equipment, and then built that up over the next few years, and was very active as a volunteer. And then in the late 90s, the school district started looking at a bond issue, and Wichita had not done one for 25 years. And so being a parent, and by this time now I had a kid in middle school, high school, and grade school, I really realized that there was a major need for upgrading our schools. And so I helped organize all of the parents and worked with the school board on getting that done. And then when that passed, our school board member wanted to run for Senate and asked me to be her treasurer. I said fine, and then when she won, she asked me to run for her seat on the school board. So I was served that for 16 and a half years.
Okay, on the Wichita School Board.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about some of your experiences on the school board and maybe some of the high points or low points or things that you remember?
Yeah, I tell people my favorite song is Pomp and Circumstance because, graduation is always the payday for board members. But I really concentrated on the budget. And a strong budget, I think, is also kind of a moral document in terms of what you think is important. And so I worked really hard. We did everything we could when we could to, raise teacher pay, upgrade, facilities and things like that. But it was also during the Brownback years. And so, with the horrendous cuts that we had to face, we had to also deal with, laying off staff and closing buildings. That was probably one of the most painful things, because there were parents and kids that had, the parents had graduated from those grade schools and they wanted their kids to go there too. And so those were kind of the difficulties. But I was very impressed with how hard our staff worked. And it didn't matter whether they were a teacher or, a para or a custodian, folks that had spent 20, 30, almost one, even 45 years working for us. And so it really caused me to be a very big believer and supporter of public ed. Those folks work their tails off for our kids. And public education is so much more important than just for my own children's education. My kids are now grown, but the kids that live on my street, I want to support them for that too, because they provide our workforce. They are our future leaders. I mean, they're all the things that the reason to invest isn't, I'm not paying my taxes for tuition. I'm paying it for public service and the benefits it brings to the entire culture.
Yeah, I'm glad you talked about that because it's one of the things I always think about is it's an investment, right?
Yes.
It's an investment in the capacity of our future, because we know that every one of these kids, like you said, in a neighborhood is eventually going to be responsible for us.
Yes.
Right. They're going to be the taxpayers. They're going to be the earners. They're going to be running companies, and they're going to be in positions like you and I have.
Yeah.
And we need them to be educated and thoughtful and understanding and know how to process hard ideas.
Yeah. And, they're the nurses that are going to measure out the medicine when we need it. They're, the folks that are running the businesses, that we need product from, or manufacturers or whatever. So yeah, exactly. It really does help our community. And I saw that in Wichita, even though it was a big district, we had 50,000 students, several thousand staff, having a well-run public school that wasn't, on the brink of disaster, attracts people to your community. It builds up the community. It keeps our taxes low because, more people come in and use the same product or same services. So.
Well, because that's one thing people look at, right? They want to know, is there a school close to my neighborhood?
Right.
Is it,
Yeah.
How is the school? Things like that. And they want to know whether this is going to work for their family.
Yeah, exactly. And we saw too that when you upgraded your facilities, one of the examples I use is our water bill, for instance. We upgraded all of the sinks and toilets and everything to be low flow and whatnot, and it just made a huge difference because it cut our use in half. And with prices going up the way it was, our rates were still the same, or our bill was still the same, but it would have been astronomical if we hadn't upgraded and updated it. And it's kind of that with all of the Riverside School here had a 1930 boiler. They were making parts because the business had gone bankrupt 50 years before. And so,
wow.
That's just not efficient in the long run. So, better use of our tax dollars.
Yeah, to stay on top of those things.
Right. Exactly.
So eventually, well, like you said, then you were on the school board and you did that for, you said, almost 17 years. Right?
Yeah.
And then you, I guess Jean
Schodorf was my senator. She had gotten beat, and then the person that beat her never wanted to talk to us about education and didn't support education. And so I was recruited to run in that seat for the Riverside area and won and had the privilege, sitting in the Senate for 2 years, and which I learned a lot. I mean, when I walked into the Senate, I knew about education and banking and ag, but there's so many issues that you deal with as a legislator that I learned a lot in a very short period of time.
Was there a little bit of a shock moving from a school board to a legislative seat?
Yeah, the partisanship. And on the school board, we never talked about parties, and I served with both Republicans and Democrats, and had been a Republican until I ran for Senate. And running in a partisan race, of course, kind of got me used to that. But then just the partisanship, where people would stand up and say, "We need to do this for our party," as opposed to doing this for our state, made a big difference in my mindset. And I guess my philosophy is that we may run as a Republican and we may run as a Democrat, but when we get to Topeka, we really need to be Kansans. What do we need to do to fix the problems that we have in front of us? And we can disagree on what the problem is or even how to fix it, but by working together, I think we can get better responses. And that's what I hoped we could see, because that's how I saw it in the school board, was that, when you have seven, one person has an idea and somebody else can build on it, and you talk about it for a while and then progress and solve it, so to speak, or at least try another method of fixing the problem if the first one doesn't work.
Yeah, the process at school districts and city councils and county levels seems to be a lot more collaborative and willing to bring in those other ideas.
Yeah,
it's
gotten a little bit more partisan, unfortunately, but yeah, you could listen and being in the city council or school board, I would get a packet of 200 or 300 pages for every board meeting. Mm-hmm. And when I went on the board, I thought, I know how to answer all these questions, or I know how to do this. But then when you sit at the table for the first time, you realize that this is people's livelihoods. The two things they think are the most important, their kids and their money, is what they send to the school district. And so they have opinions, but you need to know the details and you need to understand the consequences of those. So, that's what I really liked about that work, was we could deal with those on a much more local level.
Mm-hmm. And and in a way that was solution oriented.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Instead
of just partisanship.
Yeah.
So,
So you did 2 years in the Senate, and then you got tapped to be lieutenant governor. Right.
Yeah. I sat in the back row next to then Senator Kelly, and I always laughed that she leaned over one time and said, "Why don't you run for lieutenant governor with me while I run for governor?" And I think I was told her that my response was, "Oh, sure. What kind of trouble could that get me into?" So little did I know. Little did I know.
Well, and that experience, you now, that's a bigger role. That's a statewide role. So now instead of representing a district in Wichita, which
I
you're
represent
familiar
the whole
with,
state.
the whole
Yeah.
state. So
Yeah.
talk to me about that.
Well, and I asked specifically to work with our rural communities because of my rural banking experience, and the governor wanted to start what was called the Office of Rural Prosperity. And so, but before we implemented anything, I wanted to make sure that we did a major listening tour. So that first summer, we spent most of the summer on the road visiting over 25 cities, 12 key cities, and then a lot of places around there. We tried to get into each region of the state, talk to as many people during the day as we could, and really heard sometimes from people that had never heard before. Because during the campaign, we often heard that people said they didn't feel like they got listened to by Topeka, and I do think there's sometimes where we almost too much of a bubble in Topeka. But when we got out and talked to people, what we found was that communities needed help with things that would improve their lifestyle, their way of life. People appreciated living in the rural communities, but they didn't have access to broadband. There wasn't housing available in a lot of these communities that were growing or needed to grow, and childcare. Those were really big issues. And then a lot of smaller, ancillary issues. But I was really encouraged. We did the first housing study that the state had done in 29 years. And then, of course, this year in the legislature, you guys responded partly because we had the money finally because of overturning some of the bad tax bills. But we could invest now in those rural communities. And broadband, I mean, I've had problems with broadband here, even in near downtown Wichita, in our home in Riverside. But we knew it's even worse in rural communities. I always carried my state phone and my personal when we were on those travels, and I'd always do a check to see how many bars I had. And it was amazing with even two different carriers, how often neither one had a বার. And we'd go to towns and one said, well, you can get, you got to get up on this hill, or you got to go to this. And so those were discouragement. But they've been able to invest in some broadband that we haven't. I think we have 50,000 more Kansans on better broadband than we did. So it's coming, but it's still a long ways to go. But if you want to start a business, you want to shop, go to the doctor. I mean, we really found that in COVID, you need good broadband. So.
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit of information out there that is key to it. I mean, the housing and the childcare plays a huge role too. But I know what I've heard over and over is we can't get businesses here if they can't access the internet.
Yeah.
Families that might want to move here
wouldn't even consider it. Yeah.
There was a legislator who I really enjoy, and he lives out in Fowler, Kansas.
Oh yeah.
And he always had the saying that it won't matter what we offer if people can't watch Netflix, they're not going to move to Fowler, Kansas.
Well, and that was the one area that they really had done some pre-planning of if they could get money, this is where they were going to invest it. So they were ready to go with some of that. And that's one of the things what we try to encourage too is it wasn't going to be the state that would fix these things. We would address them, and there are things the state can do, but it was still going to take local leadership. And we saw that too in some communities. Some of the leaders were tired, and they needed somebody to step up, and so the older volunteer needed to make sure that they're willing to turn things over to a younger person. That was sometimes tough, but the younger folks needed to step up to lead and to really make your community viable for the future. You needed to figure out a way to work together locally, and then tap into the state and federal resources that you could
and pull those into your community.
And pull those in, yeah.
Which I think, and to get off topic, but I think small communities have a real struggle with that because they don't often have like a volunteer city council. Yeah. And usually if they have any staff, it's a part-time city clerk or something, and they don't have that sort of expertise to pull down some of those federal dollars.
Yeah.
I remember when you came to Hutch and went through several places in Hutch, and then we had what I thought was a pretty good showing out at Nickerson with people, and they didn't seem to be too bashful about talking about some of their needs.
And we had those listening sessions in 12 cities. We'd start about 7:00 in the morning, hit 4 or 5 cities near one of our major cities, and we visited manufacturers, we talked with farmers, we talked with business people, we went to schools, we did a really wide variety, and then we would culminate with a discussion. We'd ask people what's working, what's not working, what do we need to do better? What were the hot spots? And Nickerson was it was our first one. I think we had over 75, 80 people there, and great discussions. And that's really what we then put into effect. I just think it's really, Kansans, if they're asked for their advice and their ideas, they can solve a lot of things. They can do a lot of things, but we just need to empower them to do it and make sure that we were listening finally.
Yeah. I thought that was a great trade. And you produced your office, or the Office of Rural Prosperity, produced an entire report based on all of that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And then the next year with COVID, we did it virtually, but we kind of repeated some of the same things. We tried to meet with people by Zoom, and part of it too is highlighting what's going on, because what we found too is one community oftentimes had the same need of another community, and so we tried to connect them together. So if one had built a child care center like Phillipsburg, we highlighted that so that other communities would see, oh, okay, I can go learn from them and don't necessarily have to follow a cookie cutter approach. So.
And there are Phillipsburg for child care. Phillipsburg and Lindsborg are two that comes to my mind,
right?
Where they've deployed some pretty creative solutions to child care.
Yeah,
that is a collaborative between private industry and city government, local government, finding a solution to the problem.
Yeah, because business, what we saw in Phillipsburg, business really responded because they had employees that needed childcare, and most of our rural communities need more workers, and so if you can make sure both spouses, if they want to work, can, but they want to make sure that they've got adequate childcare and adequate education for their kids too. So.
Well, to me, it really sounds like it's kind of not a single thing that's going to lift rural Kansas, right? It's kind of an ecosystem problem.
Yeah, that's what everybody kind of thought we could get a silver bullet, and there isn't. But you got to do all those kind of things at the same time, and then we also encourage communities to start the hard part of planning and again taking advantage of an opportunity when it raised its head, because not always was it going to be available. And many of them realized that getting a factory of 500 employees wasn't going to be their solution. They couldn't even do it if they didn't have highways or if they didn't have housing available. So they needed to start small to kind of build that and kind of work on all of those things at the same time. But it came through really loud and clear that it wasn't a tax situation for most of them. It was the quality of life. People wouldn't come to their community if they didn't have the things like education and activities for your family. Even if it wasn't in your own community, it needed to be close enough that they could participate
and do something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you do that for 2 years, and you were really engaged in that, and then then there's a vacancy in the treasurer's office, and you get tapped for that. So I'm starting to see you kind of suffer from this. If you want to. How's the saying go? If you want to find someone who will volunteer, find the person who's busy.
Yeah. The governor asked if I had some names to fill because of my banking, background. Then she kind of tossed the names aside and just said, well, would you like to do it? And I thought for a second, I really loved being lieutenant governor, and it is, it's an exceptional honor to do that. But the treasurer is really something I could sink my teeth into, and really, I tell people all the time, it fits my skill set. And we have a very professional office, but they needed to be unleashed to serve Kansans, and so I really appreciated the opportunity to serve in this role.
So for people who don't know, probably our extent of understanding of what the treasurer's office does is when you're at the fair and saying you can look up and see if we've abandoned a bank account.
If we've got a bank account. Yeah. I tell people I'm the state banker. I balance the checking account every day. I don't, my staff does. We make sure that all the checks that are cashed and written and cashed clear, and that we don't have, any extra checks that shouldn't be in there. We issue all the bonds for cities, counties, and school districts, and make sure that those payments get made each and every year. We don't collect the taxes, that's the Department of Revenue, but we do issue the tax payments to our cities and counties and things of that nature. And then we have the idle funds where we can loan idle dollars to agriculture, housing, economic development. We did the rural, the city utility loans last year during the high energy prices. We do the unclaimed property. We have about 400 million of bank accounts that have been abandoned. And a lot of people, we go to grocery stores and coffee shops and talk to people and ask if they have unclaimed property, and they can't figure out why they would. But what they don't realize is oftentimes we have it and they don't even know that we have it. It is, bank accounts that, family member has forgotten about and hasn't opened, but it also includes rebates and refunds and checks that, utility checks that don't make it to where it's supposed to go. In some cases it's, the address is even correct, but the mail just didn't deliver it. We were in Lyons last year, and little coffee shop, Lyons, Kansas, and an older guy comes in and he didn't have anything, but we looked up his wife's name. She had passed away a few years earlier, and she had 4 life insurance policies totaling $300,000, and he didn't know that they had been paid out or that she even had them. And so, we were able to connect people like that. And so, it's kind of a wide variety of why we have the money, but it's really my job to get it back to them, as much as we can. So.
Now, it's fascinating me to think that, one of the things that I always think is there's so much that happens in processing or executing whatever government function there is. And as you were describing that, I think there's a lot to this office that we don't even think about.
Well, and one of the things that has been helpful, with my banking background, is there's been a number of things that we've been able to update systems and software. We had an unclaimed property database that was 16 years old. And it was going to get revamped a few years ago, and it got canceled by a previous treasurer. We had to get it back on track because the national standards have changed. But even more importantly, we hold a lot of private information on these bank accounts, social security numbers and things. So we really want to make sure that they're protected. And so we are in the process of upgrading that one. To pay a city to pay a bond payment, they had to go into the bank, get a form notarized by their banker with their bank accounts, and then send it to us each and every payment, which is extremely, and then during COVID was difficult to do as well. We were able to get the law changed where, that can now be saved from year to year and protected, electronic records, but they don't have to update that with their local banker anymore. So things like that we go through. I tell people it's like we're kind of catching up to year 2022 banking rules, because there's just so much that has changed technology wise. We want to use the most current technology that we can.
Yeah, that's interesting because I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, somebody would have to go like from a city, and they'd have to go to their bank every
whether
time
the payment was, whether it was monthly, quarterly, or annual. They had to do that each and every time they did that. So and again, we've got 3,000 bond issues, and they would have had to do it for each bond. So a city that had multiple bonds or a school district would have to do that multiple times. So
this really reduces the amount of paperwork and
right.
engagement that people have to have just to fill out a form.
Just to fill out a form. Yeah, exactly. So there's other things we'd like to do. We keep looking at how do we upgrade and update and use the most recent technology. We have our own IT staff, which has been very helpful, because again, recently the line between us and the Federal Reserve went down, so our staff were able to fix it, almost immediately. If we had that out to a private company, it would have been based on how soon they could have gotten to it. And so those are the kind of things that again, it's important because the sooner we can provide that service to the city, the less work they have to do. The less resources they have to do for what I call busy work.
Busy work, yeah.
So, yeah.
And then you mentioned the idle funds, and I just learned about this since being in the legislature. I didn't even know this was a thing. Can you talk about that a little bit?
We've got 3 programs that you can borrow money from the state. We call them linked deposit accounts. Our most active is the agricultural loan program. Farmer can borrow. They work with their local bank. The bank borrows from the state up to $250,000 per person, and we loan it to them at a lower than average cost. So it's around maybe 3.25%, something like that, or 3.5%, depending on what rates are doing. And so that savings can be returned to the producer from that standpoint. The Kansas, we are protected because the funds are guaranteed by the bank. So if there's any credit loss, it's through the bank, not through us. So they get an adequate return as well. And then we also capitalize or asset, make sure that there's an asset backing the or FDI insurance on the loan itself. We have that for housing, agriculture, and then what we call economic development. The economic development was due to the COVID response. So that has taken off a little bit. The disappointing one is our housing loan. We don't have that has never been used since 2008, and particularly when you think of how housing needs in our community, how big it is, we need to get that revamped. Right now, it's a loan that would have been a 4.5% to 5% mortgage rate, and mortgages are starting to go up, but they're still in the 3 to 3.5 range, and so it wasn't a competitive product. But I look at it as something that we could maybe revamp so that we could hit our rural communities for revamping houses that have housing stock that's out of date. A rehab loan at 4.5 isn't too bad. It's pretty competitive.
Yeah.
And they could borrow it for up to 5 years, rehab it into an adequate house, and then pay it off by getting a new mortgage for the full property.
Okay.
But it would take, I think, working with some housing authorities and nonprofits as well as the local bank. So we hope to take that to the legislature next year and get that started to revamp.
And make that so it's more competitive in the marketplace.
Right. And I think we need to give the treasurer some flexibility that that the dollar amount can change slightly. When they started at 250, that was, of course, that's the insurance amount, but there are times where that might need to be higher. And again, we want to make it fair so that everybody that wants access to it can. But if it sits idle and doesn't do anything, it doesn't help us either.
It's not doing any good.
Yeah.
So you've done a lot of these things over time, and you've done a lot of public service. Talk a little bit about why someone would want to do public service, or why do you want to do public service?
Well, growing up, my dad and grandpa were both on the school board, the school that I grew up in. And my dad and grandpa particularly always used to say that was his rent payment for living on this earth, doing something to better your community. And, I think that started when I first started volunteering with the parent-teacher organization in the school. Was how do we make that school better than when we found it? I've seen that with the neighborhood as well, working with them. I like the people that I've met through doing this, even when I don't always agree with them, there's some very fascinating people, that you get to have some exposure to. And I think most people want to leave their environment better. And so to me, that's a big part of it. To me, my best accomplishments were not getting elected to any of these offices. It's, really being married, raising, 3 great kids and having some grandkids that we can influence and being a good citizen. So it's going to Topeka every week. I mean, I commute up every Sunday night and come home usually on Fridays. And then during the week we'll travel. I think since August I've put on over 20,000 miles just, throughout the state for unclaimed property and our 529 accounts. But, I love meeting the people as well. I think it's important that our elected officials also get out of Topeka and be in the real world so that we can hear. It's amazing, the events that we have, oftentimes people will bring a concern. It has nothing to do with being the treasurer, but I do know where I can direct it and where I can funnel it. So at least I can serve, in that way as well.
Don't you find that, for me, I find that to be one of the most rewarding parts of the job, is that you can actually in some way solve or help solve
somebody.
Problem.
Yeah. They still need to take it from there, but even getting it to the right person, makes a huge start. And, the ordinary citizen wouldn't know how that operates, if they're not in it every day. I didn't know how Topeka worked until, I got there, type of thing. And it is, getting it to the right agency. So.
And that's the thing about it, because it's overwhelming when and sometimes I think we forget that. We get used to that, and we forget how overwhelming it is. And then even in something like the Department of Revenue, there's there's a division of motor vehicles, and then there's a tag office, and there's all these different divisions within that, and it can be overwhelming for people.
So, and that legislative work helped me understand, the big picture from the budget, standpoint, similar to what, I learned on the school board was, having the right budget and, knowing where money is spent. And I think people also, they think we can solve all of the problems. And if we could, we would have already. I mean, I often heard on the school board, well, if you just did this, and it's like one night I had 3 people in a row tell me that. And I said, well, after the third one, I finally said, is it this or this? And they'd say, well, no. Why'd you even say that? I said, because the last 2 people just told me that. And all of a sudden that guy kind of got it. It's like, oh, I understand. There's more than one thing you have to do. And it's like, yeah, you've got to get a lot of balls in the air at the same time to get things moving forward.
One thing, and I'd be curious to see if you found this same way. One thing that's been very interesting to me, or very humbling for me, is to realize that you can't pull the thread in one place without wrinkling the sweater somewhere else.
Somewhere else. Yeah.
Everything in our world is so interwoven that you think, oh, if you just do this one thing, that will solve a problem. It can solve a problem, but it also creates. We always talk about that it may create problems somewhere else if we haven't thought it through.
I see that a lot, because we respond to legislative bills, and we are asked oftentimes for fiscal notes on how something should work. And when I first got over there, they said, yeah, the legislature leaves us alone. And we said, well, if they leave us alone the way they've left us alone, we're swamped, because all these bills do have an impact of some way. And so that's part of my job too. During the legislative session, we keep very busy responding to those kinds of things, how this school education program might work, or how medical marijuana might work. All of those kind of things ultimately go through our banking system. And so we need to use the most, up-to-date banking laws and products that we can. And so that's been kind of a challenge for us to help, educate legislators too on how that's, a lot of legislators don't have financial experience. And so we've been able to help them in some cases as well.
Well, because like we talked about earlier, everything, like I hadn't thought about medical marijuana, but if there's a tax stream on that, eventually that's going to flow through your office.
Right. And the banking system, they were going to limit us to a very narrow way of doing the banking. And so we got an amendment in there that said if it passes, that you would let the treasurer use the best solution they could come up with. And, again, as long as it's legal and fine. And that was advice we got from other treasurers that had, kind of gone through it, which is one of the nice things about the job is there's 49 other treasurers for the most part. And so we can pick up the phone and talk to them if they've done it or
say, how does this work in your state?
Right, exactly. Because they've probably already, and they've already called us on like our empowerment accounts, our city utility loan programs, those kinds of things. That's been part of it too. So.
Yeah, that's really nice to be able to have that resource out to call and say, hey, what do we do here?
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned your family and your grandkids. I know you have 3 kids, right?
We have 3 kids. Yep.
And how many grandkids?
We have 3. So our son and daughter, our daughter-in-law, are attorneys in Oklahoma, and they have 2, a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. Our daughter and son-in-law are teachers in the Kansas City area, and they have a 5-year-old. And then our youngest son lives with us here in Wichita. So. Okay. And then we're down here in kind of the central core of Wichita, which this area is just this Riverside neighborhood is such a beautiful area. Yeah.
And you've lived here.
We've been here 37 years now. We've owned 3 different houses in the neighborhood. I'm actually currently on project probation. I can't start another project in an old house until I get one done. And it's been on the road as much as I have. I haven't been able to do that so much. But yeah, we love the older neighborhoods, the older houses, and we love our neighbors. We know most of our neighbors, and the thing that slows mowing down is when you go out and mow and you see a neighbor across mowing, you stop and talk in the middle of the street and all. So Riverside is really just a small town, and I see that in a lot of our communities. The neighborhood it may be a big city, but there's a lot of small neighborhoods inside, small towns inside.
Now, do you like to do rehab projects?
I am good at the destruction part, not the construction part. So that makes a difference. We've had some good friends that have helped us with some of that. I do like to do the mowing and whatnot. It's very therapeutic to be to be away from numbers for a while to just mow and not think about things. So, but again, I don't get home enough to get to do it as much as I need to. So.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
One thing I was going to ask you earlier is kind of on your travels around the state, either as lieutenant governor or as treasurer. Was there a part of the state that you got to that you hadn't been to before, or something that kind of like I didn't know this was in Kansas?
Well, I mean, I had traveled Western Kansas, Eastern Kansas, for 31 years at the bank. And I was usually gone. I would put on 70,000 miles a year for that. So there wasn't a whole lot that surprised me other than Little Jerusalem State Park. I'd been out to Northwest Kansas for years and years and had never really ever seen, Little Jerusalem until last summer. One of the things that this job has allowed me to do is it's allowed me to stop at some things that I've driven by before. Wamego, there's the Columbian Theater, the Oz Museum. As lieutenant governor and the ORP and even as treasurer, people are very proud to show off their areas. So I got to see things that many people wouldn't have gotten to see, otherwise. So that's been kind of cool.
I do like that there's always something in a small town that they'll say, hey, you got to see this.
Gotta come see this. Yeah, exactly.
Or some lore or story that's really interesting.
I've learned more specifics. Found out where there's some good, pie places and ice cream. My staff have been instructed to make sure I stop wherever I can, and my wife tries to tell them don't let them do that. But
there are some good places to eat.
Yeah, out there. Yeah. I think people are very proud of where they live, even if it's a very small community, and they should be. And I see people that even live in our bigger cities, oftentimes they're the product of our small towns. Mm-hmm. And so it's really important that our small towns and large towns work together because, we've got to keep these kids in our state and adults in our state. We've definitely got the jobs available, but they want to live in a community that is, will take care of them, mm-hmm. that, they don't want to fight, they want to get along with their neighbors and work together.
Yeah. Yeah, I think kind of finding a way to create an understanding between like urban parts of Kansas and rural parts of Kansas is really important.
Yeah, really, really key. Yeah, and I think it's very short-sighted when we try to sell one off the other because the rural needs the urban and the urban needs the rural. I try to preach that a lot at the Office of Rural Prosperity. So
yeah, no, that's good work. Well, there's one question I always kind of wrap up with is, and for yours, I've kind of got it broken into two options. Just tell me one thing that people might not know about you or about your role as treasurer that you kind of wish they knew.
Okay. Well, one story, and I've told this to a few people, is that when I was in college, I was actually Winnie the Pooh on national TV for the Special Olympics when I worked at Sears when I was in college, and they sponsored it, and so I got to be in the Winnie the Pooh costume and lost about 25 pounds. So it was a great opportunity because it was all outside and outdoors. So I always tell people that's the one different one. As treasurer, I think one of the big things is that there's a lot of services that we provide. Probably the big thing is our 529 Learning Quest accounts for helping kids prepare for education. We have our Scholar Shop that, we've got a database of 6 million scholarships for $30 billion. And now we've updated our ABLE for families that are living with a disability. There's some programs there that can really help for people's future. And so I really encourage people to check those things out and, hopefully use those to benefit their own financial condition, because when their financial condition improves, the state's financial condition improves as well. So if there's things that we can help them with, that's what I would really like them to know about.
And I imagine that your office is pretty accessible, right? If people want to,
our website is kansascash.ks.gov. So the word Kansas, the word cash.ks.gov. And there's a mechanism on there that you can send us an email if you have a question. There'll be 800 numbers for the Learning Quest or for the ABLE accounts. You can search for unclaimed property while you're there. You can learn about the fiscal services from the state. We try to keep that updated. We're hoping to add a Spanish section soon so that people can, bilingual can connect with it. A lot of things there that we can update, but that's a great starting point.
Good, good. Well, thanks for all your years of service to education and the state. And thanks for inviting me into your wonderful sunroom here today for a visit.
Well, thanks. I've enjoyed the conversation. It's good to connect. So yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to thank a few of the people who've helped make that podcast in Hutch possible. My son Mitchell Probst wrote and recorded the music for the show. Jenny Brigette put together some great graphics and promotional art. And Chris Acker helps overcome my mistakes to produce a great sounding product every episode. That podcast in Hutch is made possible through a collaboration between the Hutchison Arts and Culture Collective and Salt City Sound. They're working to bring resources and infrastructure to support art, music, and storytelling in our community. If you have an idea for your own podcast, reach out to them at podcasts@saltcitysound.net. If you enjoy that podcast in Hutch, be sure to subscribe and share it with all your friends. You can also help support this production by subscribing to thatguyinhutch.substack.com or by emailing me at thatguyinhutch@gmail.com to learn about sponsorship opportunities. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next week.
A Salt City Sound production.